assignments. There's really a lot to cover in your reading, and so what I thought I'd do is kind of give you all a kind of a brief overview of all the reading material you're going to be covering for this week. And it covers basically 200 years of history, the 17th and the 18th centuries of the early modern period. Now, I've never done this kind of thing before, so hopefully this video is helpful to you. And so if I screw up, just please be understanding that I'm trying something new. I just learned how to do this today. All right, so first of all, we're going to talk about the 17th century. And in the 17th century, we see that the Little Ice Age that had been devastating Europe, really going back to the late 13th century, there had been a little bit of a respite for about 150 years in the 16th century and the late 15th century. But then in the 17th century, what we're studying now, it just came back with a vengeance. So 17th century was one of the coldest on record, and when you have very, very cold temperatures, that means short growing seasons. And so the 17th century was a period when crop failures were frequent. There was, as a result of that, there was famine, and with famine, there always comes epidemic disease, plague, and other types of epidemic diseases. And so it was a very devastating time to live. And whenever times are tough and people are hurting economically, that's often a time when there's a great deal of political unrest. And we can see that definitely in the 17th century with all the revolutions and wars and revolts that took place in this period. And you'll read about them in your reading assignment. Now, if you look at the 17th century, one of the themes of the 17th century is the rise of the state. And by that I mean that you see the rise of bureaucracies and the ability of the central government to tax, to collect taxes, and to raise armies and use those armies to maintain control and enforce the laws. And that was one of the themes of the 17th century, is the growth of these strong, powerful states. Now, these states differed. As we'll see, we see the development in Western Europe of strong nation states, where people who share a common language and culture have one government. Like France would be an example of a nation state, or Spain. In Eastern Europe, we see the rise of multi-ethnic empires, and we'll be looking at that a little later. Now, the form of government also differed. England, soon to be known as Great Britain after 1707, England developed into a constitutional monarchy. And this is a system of government where all people, including the rulers, are subject to the rule of law. And this system of government was very influential in American history because, of course, it would be England that would found what would become the 13 colonies, which would eventually become the United States of America. Now, this road to a constitutional monarchy was not easy. It was marked by war and violence and revolts. And so you have first the English Civil War between 1642 and 1649, which was a battle between the monarch, Charles I, and the rise of Parliament, which was a representative body. Now, it didn't represent all the people of England. It represented the upper classes and the landowning elites, but still it was a representative body that believed that it represented the interests of all the people of England. And then you also have the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where Parliament took upon itself to overthrow a king that it viewed as a tyrant and to replace that king with a different king, William and Mary. And this was known as the Glorious Revolution because it was a revolution. The reigning king was overthrown, but it was glorious in that it resulted in a peaceful transition of power. And Parliament exerted its authority to have sovereignty, to decide what type of government the people of England would have. Now, in France, France is an example of what we call absolutism, where it's the opposite of a constitutional monarchy. In absolutism, the king is all powerful. Probably this is best illustrated by King Louis XIV of France, who at one point said, "I am the state." And there was no power in government that could in any way limit the authority or power of the king. And the architect of this system of government would be Cardinal Richelieu, who was the advisor and the man behind the throne for Louis XIII, who was Louis XIV's father. So you're going to be reading about that. And then also, when you study the 17th century, you're going to contrast. You can contrast the nation states that arose in Western Europe, such as England, France, and Spain, with the development of multi-ethnic empires ruled by a ruling dynasty. So by the end of the 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty of Austria included Germans, Hungarians, Slavic peoples such as Slovaks, Czechs, Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes, and also Vlachs, who are known in modern times as Romanians. So it was a multi-ethnic empire that stretched across much of what is today Central Europe. And then also you had in Eastern Europe the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, this was a union of Poland and Lithuania, two different peoples. And it was they called themselves a Commonwealth because they believed that they were a republic. The Polish, in both Poland and Lithuania, you had a diet or assembly that represented the aristocratic landowners, and they were the ones who chose the king. Now, it was traditional in this Commonwealth to elect a member of the Jagiellon dynasty to be the elected king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, the fact of the matter was that this was really a case where you had very much a multi-ethnic state. So you had Poles, Polish people, in addition to Lithuanians, of course, but you also had a large number of Germans, Jews, and then various Baltic peoples like Latvians and Estonians, and Ruthenians, which is an old name that used to be used to describe what are today known as Ukrainians and Belarusians. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth extended far into Eastern Europe and included what is today the countries of Belarus and Ukraine. Another mighty empire that had been around for quite a long time, going back to the late 13th century, was the Ottoman dynasty. This was a Muslim dynasty that was ruled by a dynastic line of sultans, which is a Turkish term to describe a king. And there were so many ethnic groups in this empire that I couldn't even enumerate them. They included the peoples of the Balkans and southeastern Europe. It also included what is today the nation of Turkey. Also, it's called Anatolia. That's another name for it. It also included what used to be called Palestine, which in those days, it used to at one point include what is today the Palestinian territories, Israel and Syria and Lebanon. It also included Iraq and extended all the way to what is today Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, and then all across the northern part of North Africa, which was known as the Maghreb to Muslims, and that includes places like today is Morocco and Algeria and Libya and Tunisia, and of course Egypt. These are all part of the mighty Ottoman Empire. And then you also have in Eastern Europe the emergence of the Russian Empire. By the beginning of the 17th century, Russia was ruled by the Romanov dynasty of czars, which was the term used to describe the emperor of Russia. It comes from the word Caesar, because the Russians believed that their empire was the successor of ancient Rome and Byzantium. Now, it was also a multi-ethnic empire. So you have ethnic Russians, but also Ruthenians, what is today parts of Belarus and Ukraine. And also, the Russia began its vast expansion eastward across northern Asia in what is today called Siberia. And this was an area inhabited by many different indigenous peoples. So in Eastern Europe, you have the rise of these very strong and powerful multi-ethnic empires ruled by dynasties. And then we're going to focus on the 18th century Europe. Now, in 18th century Europe, it's marked by the rise of some new powers. When you look at the 16th century, it was Spain. That was the century of Spain. 17th century, Louis XIV and France. They were the dominant power in Europe. In the 18th century, there was no one kind of dominant power, but instead you had a number of great states emerge that had never been great states before. And one of them was Russia. Russia really emerged as a great power under the leadership of its Tsar, Peter the Great. And another great Russian ruler, or a Tsarina, was the Empress Catherine the Great. And she has an interesting story. She wasn't even Russian. She was a German princess. She married the Russian Tsar, a grandson of Peter the Great, and then arranged for him to be overthrown and murdered, and reigned for many years, even as her son came of age, and ran Russia for a long time, even though she was not even Russian. Another great power that emerged in the 18th century was the power of Prussia. Prussia was a North German state, and its greatest ruler was Frederick. A lot of greats in the 18th century. Frederick the Great, of course, who was not only Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great were not only powerful political leaders, but they were great patrons of the arts and sciences, and that's another reason why they are greatly acclaimed by historians down through the ages. And you can see, I put their portraits here. You can see here's Peter, and at the top you have Peter and Catherine, and then below them, directly below Peter, we have Frederick the Great. Now, Frederick the Great actually put Prussia on the map as a great power, but he was challenging the power of the Habsburgs, who had traditionally been the dominant power in what is today Germany and among German peoples. And the rival of Frederick the Great was Maria Theresa, the Habsburg ruler. And she was quite an amazing person. She actually was a dynamic ruler who, when she saw that her lands were in danger and that Frederick the Great posed a challenge to the Habsburg family, she defended her family and was able to keep Frederick in check. And the 18th century is marked by these two great European wars that were the base of the war was this opposition between Frederick and Maria Theresa. So you have the War of Austrian Succession between 1740 and 1748, and then you have the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763. And so these two great wars were not only wars fought in Europe, but they were world wars because they involved all the great powers of Europe, and it was a war that was fought not just in Europe, but in India and in North America. Another story of the 18th century is the rise of the British Empire. Great Britain emerged in the 18th century as, especially after the 7 Years' War, with one of the largest empires in the world, but it was all overseas. It was in North America, in what is today the United States and Canada, but also in India. The Indian subcontinent was part of this mighty and all-powerful British Empire. So these new states were one of the main storyline that comes out of the 18th century. So that's basically it. I just wanted to kind of go over some of the main ideas of the reading to be doing this week, and I hope this has been helpful.